Psalm 18. Lots of good stuff in here. We, pardon me, we ended last time where in verse 20, David writes, "The Lord rewarded me for doing right." Uh, that is a principle. And this is just my opinion, so you can take it or leave it. But in my opinion, it's a principle, not so much of a promise. The principle is that when I do the right thing, the Lord will reward me. Bear in mind, when the Lord rewards us, he doesn't do that on the basis of what we think would be the right reward, right? He doesn't even do that on the basis of what the rest of the folks in the world or the church. It's up to him. I think it's going to be. I talked about the reward thing last time, and some of my questions with that. I have this feeling, and it's nothing more than a feeling, but I think it's a valid concept that when we get to heaven, we will be astounded on every level. When John described heaven, words failed him. The best he could do was use inadequate word pictures, utilizing things that we have we know we can relate to, but they didn't tell the whole story. So there's that. But in terms of rewards, I think it's going to be jaw-dropping at the fact that there are going to be people there getting rewards that we wouldn't have rewarded that way. But here's the best news about rewards. That's not up to me. It's not up to you either. It's up to God. Okay. And he restored me because of my innocence. When you live with integrity, when you live your life in the way that David is describing here, there are some pretty obvious benefits. However, some of the benefits for us won't be known or expressed until later down the road, maybe not even in this life. In verse 21, I don't want to be mean toward David, but I'm reading this and thinking David had a pretty high estimate of himself. Listen to this. "For I have kept the ways of the Lord." Well, it's not, yes, that's a good thing. And what would be boastful about that? "I have not turned from my God to follow evil." Good. Doesn't seem boastful. "I have followed all his regulations. I have never abandoned his decrees. I am blameless before God. I have kept myself from sin." Okay. Now, part of the reason that jumped out at me when I read it is because I see me in that. I see my spiritual arrogance, that I'm looking into my life and I'm thinking, well, by golly, I'm a good guy. Look at all I've done for God. I've kept his commands, and by the way, I'm under grace, so I didn't do it and I don't have to do it in the same way that David did. So, I never turned from God to follow evil. I have followed him. Well, yes, generally. um, and when he says in verse 22, I have followed all his regulations. I'm just finishing up in my morning reading, Bible reading. I use a great plan. It's great for me. I get it by using YouVersion online, and it's called Eat This Book, where we read 3 or 4 chapters out of the Old Testament and a psalm every day until we finish the Old Testament. Then we read 3 or 4 chapters in the New Testament and a psalm every day. And so it's not chronological. I've done the chronological before, and it's fine, but I just like this better. But anyway, my thing is, my recommendation in terms of this stuff, there's dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of plans on YouVersion. Get a plan going and dive into the Word. Anyway, in my mornings readings, I'm not doing this to study. I'm just doing this to listen. Okay. I finished Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and now I'm finishing up Deuteronomy. And when David says, I have followed all his regulations, I'm reading these regulations and thinking, how in the world would anybody be able to keep that in their head? I sure couldn't. And yet David says, I've kept all the regulations. And then he says, I've never abandoned his decrees. And I'm going to just say in a general sense, okay, I get that. Especially at the time when David was writing this. See, this was before he became king. This was in a season of his life. If he was already Israel's king, it was very early in his reign. Before Bathsheba, before he had Uriah killed, before his family imploded. This was early. And he had a incredible seriousness about following God and honoring everything. I would put it this way: everything he understood about God's design, God's law, God's regulations. And he said in verse 23, I am blameless before God. Wow, take a breath. This is me again. I know of only one who was blameless before God, and that was Jesus. Me? Well, I can say I'm blameless before God, but for a whole different reason than David said he was. David said he was blameless before God because he had not committed any sin. He had not broken any of the regulations. He had never abandoned God's decrees. Me, I'm blameless before God because of grace. I'm blameless before God because Jesus took the blame for me. When I think about the vast difference in walking with God now on this side of the cross as opposed to back then before the cross, I'm just so grateful. I wouldn't have made it back then, I don't think. I don't think David is being egotistical here. And yet, I think he may have overestimated his own righteousness. But so do I. Do you ever? I don't want to blame anybody here, but I'll just make an observation that most everybody I know has at one time or another had an inflated opinion of their own goodness and their own righteousness. I think it was the prophet Isaiah that said, all our righteousness is like filthy rags. That is a cleaned up translation, actually an interpretation. The actual, more literal translation is kind of crude. It's like we would call it today feminine napkins. In the day Isaiah wrote it, it was women's menstrual cast-offs. That's what, I mean, all of this that David had done is that? Kinda. See, one of the things about the way God looks at us, I wonder, God told Samuel the key. This is way back when Samuel had been commanded by God, because the people of Israel had not requested but demanded a king like all the other nations around them. And it broke Samuel's heart. But God said, they haven't rejected you, Samuel. It's me. Now, I'll show you who should be the king. He showed him Saul. And Saul did pretty well for a while, and then he kind of stepped off the cliff. He commits carry on the battlefield. His prized son Jonathan is killed in the same battle on Mount Gilboa. And David became king. But before that, when David was just a boy, God sent Samuel to the house of Jesse, David's family. And all of his brothers, one at a time, handsome, strong, impressive, confident brothers, stood before Samuel, and none of them were the ones, but all of them looked like they would be. And God said, man looks on the outward appearance, but I look on the heart. And it was David, the youngest, who was out in the field tending sheep, who God designated he would be the next king. I wonder if Samuel ever told David that story. I think he probably did. Samuel was, David was in close proximity to Samuel, although Samuel died before David became king. So who knows? It's not like he was David's close personal advisor. And yet they would have had encounters. Who knows? Okay. All I'm saying is, I think David was thinking like a Jew in his day. The way to a blameless relationship before God was to never do anything that you could be blamed for. That doesn't mean getting away with it. It means you don't do that. It just doesn't. You don't do that. That's how you stay blameless. How could he know about God's grace and the sacrifice of Jesus was hundreds of years in the future? He could not know like we do. That's because of the righteousness of Jesus, that I am blameless before God. I have kept myself from sin. This we got to come back to next time, because it's worth at least a little bit of a trip down a bunny rabbit hole. I'll see you then on So Care with Stevie Boy.